I'm thinking.
Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, March 18th, and we officially have our March Madness brackets out. So today we are doing a special episode where we are going to be breaking down all things college basketball from an overview of the bracket to the biggest storylines and biggest dark horse teams to potentially make a run in this year's tournament. We're going to additionally be talking about the biggest NBA draft prospects that are in the tournament this year, as well as getting into the conversation surrounding the exclusion of certain programs that had some people up in arms and the potential of expansion in March Madness. But before we get into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. And for any of our live viewers to feel free to use the comment section, put in your thoughts about the show, about March Madness. We will try and address as many questions as possible. Additionally, feel free to leave a tip or donation using the link gsmcpodcast.net. It would really be appreciated. But now getting into the overview of the March Madness tournament that was just updated. We had a wild week of conference tournament games that resulted in a handful of bid-stealing teams and some surprises that were left out. But we are going to be starting by talking about the teams that did make the tournament. Looking at the top 8 seeds that were ranked, we had UConn being the number 1 overall seed, followed by Houston, Purdue. Those were the 3 sort of no-brainer first number 1 seeds. And then North Carolina did grab the final remaining number 1 seed available, followed by Tennessee, Arizona, Marquette, and Iowa State as the 2 seeds. Iowa State being the number 8 overall was probably one of the bigger surprises when it came to the seeding of the tournament, considering the fact that they just beat down on some very good teams in Baylor and Houston in the Big 12 tournament, won by a combined score of 42 versus both of those teams, and now they are the 8th overall team. They probably had a better case in my eyes to being the last remaining 1 seed, but instead they are number 8. Again, ultimately this only results in them being a 2 seed, so it's not the end of the world for them, but definitely came as a big time surprise here. KenPom has them rated as the highest number 2 seed, so by those metrics closer to the 1 seed than where they are. Backs up the eye test, but ultimately the committee decided what they did, and this is the results of it. And because of that, getting into the regions here, it leads to an absolutely stacked Eastern region where you have UConn as the number 1 overall seed. They play closest to home, and they get rewarded with a little bit of a gauntlet of a region here where, along with UConn, who won the Big East tournament, there are also the winners of the SEC tournament, Big 12 tournament, and Big 10 in Auburn, Iowa State, and Illinois. It has also 3 of the 4 teams that were in the Final Four last season. Now, of course, different year does not mean it is the exact same team, but along with UConn, there is also San Diego State and Florida Atlantic that are going to be in this region as well. Not to mention that BYU, as a 6th seed, is pretty scary. They are 12th in the country in net rating, so another very dangerous team there as well. In terms of KenPom rankings, the East has the top-ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8 seeds in the conference. So at the top of the rankings here, there is nothing but talent in the Eastern region. Because of all of this, I think it is probably going to be the most chalked region in terms of seeing any kinds of big time upsets. There are some smaller ones, Northwestern versus FAU as the 9 versus 8. I think that Northwestern will win this game, although they are dealing with an injury to one of their big guys that could prove to be fatal for them as well. There is also a 7-10 matchup between Washington State and Drake that should be interesting, where Washington State, the 7 seed, is actually underdogs according to ESPN Bet in this matchup. Drake is currently favored by 1.5 points in this one. So I like Washington State. I think that Jalen Wells has been a really fun watch this season as well. But I do think that it makes sense. Drake has emerged as one of these top tier mid-major teams making the tournament for at least the 2nd year in a row. And they have one of the leading scorers in the nation in Tucker DeVries, who is scoring 21.8 points per game. So again, Drake is actually favored in this specific matchup. But other than that, I do think that you have a lot of teams here. 11-seeded Duquesne, who is probably the most overseeded team in this tournament. A lot of people are saying that the selection committee essentially just thought that this was going to be VCU coming out of that conference. Duquesne ends up winning. They just slotted them into the 11. And I don't know, maybe this is one of those upsets that absolutely nobody sees coming, but it does seem pretty unlikely that they would be the upset here. You also have a 13th seeded Yale that was not really, they're a good team, don't get me wrong, but they sort of caught a break when Princeton got beat up on by Brown in the semifinals. They end up battling with Brown down to the final seconds where they win on a buzzer beater. So credit to the Bulldogs there. I think that, again, when you're looking at the top of this region, though, there's just too much talent, and finding the upsets there are going to be tough. UConn are currently the favorites to win it all. They're being picked in over 26% of ESPN's brackets up to this point. So they should be in a good position to at least make it to the Sweet 16. They have Stetson round 1, the winner of Northwestern and FAU in round 2. But from there, things are going to get chippy in that region and should be a great watch. Moving on to the West here, this is UNC as the number 1 seed. I think that this region is one of the most open ones that there is. Between a couple teams that were slightly over or underseeded, there is a pretty good chance for some matchups in this one. You have a 5-12 game in St. Mary's and Grand Canyon that should be a really good matchup. I think this is going to be a very popular upset pick. I actually do like St. Mary's a lot this year, but Grand Canyon is also the top-ranked 12 seed in terms of both KenPom and net rating. So that should be a good game, I think, as a whole. Charleston is another team where they flew a little bit under the radar. We talked about this on the show last week, where they were a very popular upset pick last season, and now here they are in a similar position. They win 27 games, and they're going to be matching up against an Alabama team that does struggle on the defensive side of the ball. Now, the Cougars aren't much better, if at all, on defense, so this could be a high-scoring matchup. I think I'm taking Bama in this one, but I do think that this could be in the realm of a potential upset. New Mexico is another double-digit seeded team that should have a lot of value. Clemson got a little bit of the short end of the stick matching up against New Mexico in this one, where it's interesting because New Mexico could have been left out of the tournament as a whole. They had to win their conference tournament in the Mountain West, and they did so, but this is a better team, I believe, than just being a bubble team that ended up winning their conference. I do think that there is real value with them. They're in the 20s in terms of net rating, for whatever that means. And Clemson's a good program too, but this is a tough matchup for them in the first round. I do want to briefly just touch on the idea of this Mountain West Conference and sort of the pressure that they are under in this year's tournament, where they had a record 6 teams being selected in the cut of the 68. Now, Colorado State and Boise State are both part of the last 4 in. They'll be playing, I believe they're matched up Tuesday and Wednesday to play their games to get in, but still a big deal for the conference, and it does feel like they are going to have this spotlight on them because we haven't seen the Mountain West perform well in the NCAA tournament in years past, but last year we did have San Diego State roll off into that Final Four appearance, and maybe we have a little bit of an updated precedent in this one, but in order for that to be the case, we have to see that happen consistently. So this is the year with their most amount of teams in the dance here that maybe they can overcome that reputation that they've had in the past. I do think that Dayton was a little bit overseeded as a 7 seed. I'm just not a real believer in the Flyers this year, and I do think that that could be an upset waiting to happen. They are scheduled to go up against Nevada in the first round here. Out of this region, the number one thing that I am rooting for is to see UNC and Arizona potentially match up. The 1 and 2 seeds in the group here, where they could be meeting in the Elite 8, and we could see Caleb Love with Arizona have a chance to go up against his former team in the Tar Heels, the team that he went to the national championship game with a couple seasons ago. Now a member of a new team, and the two of them squaring off for a chance to go to the Final Four. I think that that would be cinema, so I am very much hoping for that to happen. We'll see what college basketball gods have planned for us in that department. Next on, we have the South here. This is Houston's region. For a defense and rebounding team that Houston is known for, I do think that there is a tough matchup that could be waiting for them in the round of 32 if Texas A&M is able to beat Nebraska. That's a team that has some size. They have the scoring that's been coming from Wade Taylor IV as of late. So that could definitely be interesting. Houston looking to rebound after losing by 28 points to Iowa State in the Big 12 championship game. That at least came as a surprise to me. I think that it did for most people, and now they're looking for a little bit of vengeance. But this is a matchup in A&M, assuming, again, that the Aggies are able to come out of the round of 64. Just something to look at there, I feel like, with Houston. In this region, we also have Wisconsin and James Madison, a 5-12 matchup that does really scream upset. James Madison started off extremely hot in the beginning of the year, found their way into the top 25, fell out of that, but as a 12 seed does seem to be a bit underseeded here, and a Wisconsin team that lost. I'm just not a big fan of the Big Ten as a whole, really, and to have double-digit losses in the Big Ten, I think that is going to be a popular pick, and I'm probably going to be picking that one as well. Interestingly enough, in this region as well, we have the ACC champions and the bid stealer of NC State coming in as an 11 seed. This, I don't have the statistics on. It feels like it has to be one of the lowest seedings for a Power 5 champion in recent history, but they were the second team to ever pull off the 5 games and 5-day run and end up winning the ACC. So just for the storyline here, I am rooting for NC State a little bit. DJ Burns has really won over the nation, the electric big man from NC State. So we will see how far that run can go. They have Texas Tech in the first round, who is a good program. If they can get through to that, I do feel like Kentucky could potentially be a winnable game for them there. But again, that's sort of asking a lot there. We also have a 7-10 matchup here, Florida, and we will find out who they'll be playing after the Boise State-Colorado game. But I would be keeping an eye open if Colorado finds their way into this position. They've been red hot down the stretch of the season and could definitely put together a run. Closing out the first segment here, talking about the Midwest. This is Purdue's region. Purdue, of course, the team that is probably under the most individual pressure in the tournament after 3 straight losses to double-digit seeds. There is a lot of room for upsets in this conference. I think that Gonzaga and McNeese State is a potential matchup there. McNeese State winning 30 games. Gonzaga did all this work after a slow start in the year to pull themselves together, but this is a tough matchup here with McNeese State. I also feel maybe even a little bit better in Samford versus Kansas, where Kansas has been dealing with injuries to Kevin McCullough Jr. down the stretch of the season. Hunter Dickinson also missed the Big 12 tournament, probably more so for a precautionary reason, but is something to just consider. And as we saw with Kansas really all season and was reaffirmed in the Big 12 tournament, is they really just don't have the depth to carry themselves through, I don't think, enough of this tournament. Now, same can be said for a couple other teams in the tournament as well, but I do feel like a Samford team that is very hard-nosed, sends the full court press at you as much as they can. I do think that this is a big time spot for an upset. Also intrigued to see what happens with Oregon as an 11 seed, another team that was a bid stealer going on the run to win the Pac-12. Probably would not have been in the tournament if not for that. Is an interesting team there. But then there is Creighton and Tennessee, who are 2 real contenders in terms of March Madness as a whole, and could be very interesting here. Purdue is, like I mentioned, under a ton of spotlight and pressure, which is something we will be getting more into in the second segment, where we talk about some of the best storylines coming up in March Madness, as well as some potential dark horse teams. So we will be getting into all of that on the other side of the break. Stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live, I choose to dip, you choose to fight, or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up doing the overview of the tournament as a whole, but now we're going to be starting to zero in a little bit more on some of the biggest storylines for this tournament, starting off with the conversation around UConn. Like we talked about, they are the odds-on favorite to win the tournament. They're being picked in almost over a quarter of ESPN's brackets already, and I'm sure it will continue to trend that way. They do seem like they are in the best position to repeat since Florida did 17 years ago, and Dan Hurley has had this squad really firing on all cylinders. From especially, you take a look at last week and the way that a lot of these conference tournaments played out, where you had just upsets on upsets. We had all of these bid stealing teams, and we had number one seeds falling left and right. UConn was able to come out on top pretty convincingly, and here they are after Dan Hurley is continuing to make his case that he is the best coach in college basketball, the way that they have rejuvenated themselves and been able to, acclimate some new talent as well. Stephen Castle, the freshman point guard, is having an incredible season. Maybe a bit inconsistent at times, but he has been able to really hold it down for them. They have Donovan Clingan, who has stepped into the role as the starting big man for UConn. And as we know, Adama Sanogo has been a big-time force in college basketball from the time that he was with UConn. He enters the NBA this past season, and now we have Clingan, who emerged. I was a little bit surprised when he first announced that he was coming back as a freshman, as a 7-foot, 2-inch monster, that he probably could have gone in the first round of last year's draft, but instead he wanted his chance to sort of carry the reins as the Huskies' great big man, and he has done so this year. They bring in Cam Spencer. The transfer that has been lights out for them has given them a lot of energy, a little bit of a heel role at times, but I do think in a good way. And this team is just loaded with talent, and they are in a great position. Now, again, the fact that the East region is as loaded as it is does become a little bit of an obstacle for them, but I would not be surprised at all if they are able to come through because of just how good they've been. They are, as of right now, probably my pick headed into the tournament. I have a hard time really going with anyone else. For as good as some of these other teams are in their conference, I'm going to have to lean with the Huskies here, although they are absolutely going to be battle-tested more than any other one seed in terms of some of the top-end talent that they're going to be matching up in this tournament. We also talked about the pressure that stems from Purdue. Like we mentioned, 3 straight seasons where they have lost to a double-digit seeded team. Last year being the worst of it, where they lost to Fairleigh Dickinson as a 1 seed, 16. Only the second time that has ever happened. But if you will remember from the first time that happened in the late 2010s, it was Virginia losing the first time ever as a 1 seed in the first round. Next year, they came back and won the national championship. Do I think that is how this is going to play out? No. I think that there are a handful of teams that could prove to be tough matchups for Purdue. I still don't love their depth. I've been talking about that for the longest time. It also feels like they've been very reliant on some of the calls that they've gotten, and just Zach Edey is a magnet for drawing fouls, and should those whistles not really go their way, they could be in trouble. We've seen some of these supporting cast members are better than they have been in years past, but it still is a big time question with them, and we don't really talk about legacy necessarily from an individual player for good reason. I'm glad we don't get down the full-time discourse that happens in the NBA that's just so toxic, but it is really interesting when you look at Zach Edey, who is going to likely be in the NBA next season and sort of coming off of back-to-back player of the years. What is he going to have to further stand for it? He could have his name down in infamy if he is able to sort of put a run together here with the Boilermakers. But if not, I think it's going to be very polarizing. He already is pretty polarizing in terms of how much people actually enjoy watching him play, but he can really cement his legacy with a run here. They are going to have the winner of a play-in game in the first round. Ideally, that's not going to be the case for them in terms of where their biggest matchups are going to come from, but I do think that Utah State or TCU could be decent matchups in the second round. You have some interesting teams, Gonzaga, McNeese State, Gonzaga. I always have to correct myself ever since I got the people mad about that one. But Kansas and Samford as well, definitely teams that could knock out the Boilermakers. So it does become interesting in terms of the legacy of Matt Painter, of Zach Edey, and this Purdue group as a whole. Like I talked about as well in the last segment, one of the specific matchup that I want to see more than any other is a Caleb Love versus UNC games. A game Love spent 3 seasons with UNC, started the majority of his games there, was a crucial part of the team when they lost in the national championship game in 2022. In 2023, the Tar Heels struggled. Love decided that he would want to transfer after they did not make the tournament. He lands in Arizona. Now both of these teams have positioned themselves nicely to put themselves as top seeds in one of the most open regions there is. And there's a chance they could be facing off in the Elite Eight, which would be such a great game to watch between Love and the Tar Heels, who would come out there. But we have a couple other revenge games as well that could potentially happen. Maybe not quite to the stakes of Caleb Love against UNC, but we also have Rick Barnes, the head coach of Tennessee. He spent 17 seasons with the Texas Longhorns before being fired. He then ends up in Tennessee, and now they both end up in the tournament here, and Tennessee is the 2 seed. Should they win, they would play the winner of Texas or Virginia. Colorado State are the other 2 teams that will be playing in order to reach Texas in the first place. But another potential revenge game there that could be interesting. Rodney Terry took over and helped lead them to an incredible run last season as the interim coach. They ended up giving him the full-time job, but his understudy could potentially be facing off against him in the round of 32, which would be a really fun watch. Additionally, probably the lowest of stakes in terms of revenge games that we have here, but we also do have Texas A&M just hired Trev Alberts to be their next athletic director, who is coming from Nebraska. It's funny because not only do they match up in the men's tournament, but they are matching up in the first round of the women's tournament as well. So a very funny, I don't know, I can't imagine the selection committee was trying to do too much in terms of scripting here, but maybe sometimes these things just script themselves, and it's funny how this worked out, so we could have that as well. One of the more absurd stories that could be taking place here as well, as Dan Monson, the head coach of Long Beach State, was informed a couple weeks ago that he would not be brought back for next season, right before the Big West Conference tournament. The team had lost 5 straight games headed into the tournament. The program allowed him to coach through the Big West tournament, and what do you know? They end up running the table. They make March Madness, and they are just a 15 seed, going to be in a tough matchup ahead of them against number 2 seeded Arizona, but still a pretty funny story there, and who knows, it could become legendary if the Beach do anything else from there. Just some other various thoughts here. There is a possibility that we could get a Kentucky and Marquette matchup, and it would be the Sweet 16, and this would be the 11th matchup between these two teams in the NCAA tournament, which is the most of any two programs in college basketball history. Interestingly enough, the second most is 7. So these are two programs that have been at the top of their classes for some time now, and here they are potentially meeting up yet again as the 2 and 3 seed in the southern region here. So interesting there. I guess rattling off just a couple quick potential dark horse teams. Like I mentioned, I do think that Samford, at least as a round 1 matchup, should be very interesting versus Kansas, where I think they have the athleticism, the depth, the even more so than athleticism, I think the stamina, where they are able to run this full court press defense throughout the entirety of the game. They are not afraid to work themselves, and they're going to be facing a Jayhawks team that is much shorter in terms of bench talent. We saw what happened when Dickinson and McCullough did not play in the Big 12 tournament, where KJ Adams did his best to put the team on his back and keep them in it, but they ended up falling to Cincinnati, and that one they just couldn't keep up. And, you know, ideally they're going to have Dickinson and McCullough. They were expected to be playing in the NCAA tournament. Again, this was more of a precautionary holding them out of the conference tournament. But now here we are in the big moment, and I think it is a very difficult draw for Kansas as a 4 seed. And right in that same region as well, we have Gonzaga and McNeese State, where these are two teams that we could see both the 12 and 13 come out of this region, meaning one of them would go on to the Sweet 16. Now, I myself probably don't have any double-digit seeds in the Elite 8. My number 1 bracket I have right now does have McNeese potentially making it, but again, I think that it is a little bit of a long shot as well. Sometimes you just have to take those rides a little bit, but interesting to see there. Other than that, I think that Drake could find their way into the round of 32. From there, I do think Iowa State is a very tough matchup as well. Grand Canyon is another team from the West that I think could potentially make some runs here, where St. Mary's is probably their more difficult matchup, in my opinion. They would likely get Alabama in the round of 32, which I do think would be winnable. And then from there, UNC's defense has not been quite as elite as we saw it at the beginning of the season. So Grand Canyon probably deserves some consideration as well when you are filling out your brackets. But that is all we have time for on this. We're going to be taking our second break here, and when we come back, we will be diving into the top NBA prospects in the tournament. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are all about college basketball today with the brackets coming out yesterday. We've done some overview about the top teams and storylines that are coming here. Now we're going to be getting into the top players that will be in the tournament in terms of NBA prospects. Now, the 2024 draft has not been seen to be filled with number one franchise guy talents necessarily, but I do think that there are plenty of valuable options in this draft, and we will see how the tournament ends up affecting some of their stock. When you're talking about teams that and programs that have potential NBA talent, it starts with the Kentucky Wildcats, where they easily have the most potential draft names. They've had 6 freshmen cycle through the course of mock drafts throughout the year. The clear headliners for Kentucky are Rob Dillingham and Reed Sheppard, both guards coming off of the bench for Kentucky, but they play starter minutes and they are majorly impactful. So starting with Dillingham here, he is an extremely high ceiling scorer where he just averages 15 points per game on 48-45 splits, but he does so with the self-creation variety. He's able to create for himself using the dribble. He can do so on the perimeter or getting to the rim. He's a classic heat check type of player. He reminds me some of Cam Thomas, the guard for the Brooklyn Nets, where we've seen the nights where he just can't be stopped. Now, on that same note, the shot selection can be a little bit iffy at times, but his play style definitely projects to be one that could help him reach some March Madness stardom if he and Kentucky performs. He's a solid on-ball defender, can get lost occasionally off-ball, but he projects as a high-usage scorer, either as a starter or a six-man role, and I think that he can really win over some fans if you are just tuning into college basketball for the first time this season. Reed Sheppard is really the other lottery potential guy from this Kentucky team, where it's been surprising where he's really emerged as being more impactful as a ball handler, which was not always expected necessarily. It was he was seen as more of a catch and shoot type of guy, but he has really developed his game over the course of the season. He's extremely efficient in his minutes that he comes off of the bench. He's an elite shooter, shooting 52.5% on over 4 attempts per game. He is pretty mistake prone, doesn't turn the ball over often, doesn't get beat for a lack of mentally being caught off guard or anything. Now, he doesn't have the most tremendous size in the world, but what he does have on defense is great hands. He has 2.5 steals per game. He maybe lacks the frame and physicality of your typical elite defender, which is a cause for concern for some NBA scouts. But in terms of where his game can go, I do think that he has incredible instincts, and some of the off-ball defense reminds me a little bit of the Steph Curry when he was at the prime of his powers, really, on the defensive side of the ball, where he's never going to overwhelm people with physicality, but he's extremely effective in cutting off passing lanes. Some of the on-ball stuff, as far as just knowing when to attack a dribbler, a driver, someone going up for a layup or dunk, almost reminds me of Drew Holiday at times as well, with the way that his hands are just so fast. He times himself well, and he has shown that, again, the physicality in terms of how he projects as an NBA player is something to be a little concerned about, but he has also shown that he can play defense, he can knock down shots, and there might be an untapped something with the ball handling skills that he has that he hasn't really had to put out in full use necessarily at Kentucky. It should make him very interesting. He's likely going to be a top 10 pick when it's all said and done coming in the draft, but that there are other names with Kentucky. You have DJ Wagner, the left-handed slasher, hasn't really flashed to his full potential in a lot of cases this season, but that's also sort of the case with a lot of these Kentucky players where, again, it was 6 freshmen that came in and sort of made a name for themselves, were big recruits coming into it, but just haven't necessarily fully made the most of their opportunities at times. And I think Shepard and Dillingham are just about locks to go in the lottery. The rest of some of these guys, Wagner, I think, could benefit from another year in school. You have Big Z, Avicic, the big man who wasn't granted eligibility until about halfway through the season. His playing time has been sort of sporadic. I think it would be tough for a team to pull the trigger on a first-round draft pick on him necessarily. I do like Aaron Bradshaw. I think that he's shown that with his spacing on the offensive side of the ball, plus some of what he can give you on defense, he could project to be an NBA guy. But it is going to be very interesting to see how many of these players actually take the jump to the NBA when the season is over. But outside of Kentucky here, we have a couple other programs that are filled with some big-time names. Baylor has 2 potential lottery picks, should definitely be 2 first-round picks, period. But they have Jacoby Walter and Yves Missi. Walter has varied from a potential number 1 overall guy to a late lottery pick throughout the course of the season. He can shoot, but hasn't always been consistent with it. He's 34% from 3 as a whole. There does seem like there can be a ceiling for him as a shot creator, but he doesn't have elite handle of the ball either, which seems like it could be an issue when moving to the next level. But he has the physical tools. He can do what he needs to defensively. Seems like he has a high motor. He's a pretty good rebounder for his size as well. He plays the guard position, so that's obviously not the number 1 priority, but it is going to be interesting to see how Walter plays into this, because I've really liked watching him this year, and I do think that there's something there. But again, it's not all untapped, I feel like, at this point. But I love this Baylor team. They also are another team that has this nice combination of the youth talent with some more experienced guys, so he doesn't have to do it all himself. Curious to see how this goes forward for him in the NCAA tournament. Yves Missi is another player that I've sort of had my eyes on. Didn't know much about him coming into the season, but he just sort of jumps off of the screen as somebody who has the size and frame to potentially be an NBA guy. He's a 7-footer. He's a defensive anchor, is a big-time lob threat on the other side of the ball, and he has shown some flashes of being able to have some post moves and having a decent handle for his size, but consistency hasn't been his best friend this season. But I do think that he could sort of find himself in a similar role almost to, I see a lot of Onyeka Okongwu for the Hawks in him, who, Okongwu hasn't had the most NBA success up to this point, but I still believe in Okongwu, period, and only was drafted a few years ago. And I think that one of those two-way guys that can be a disruptor in the paint on both ends does definitely intrigue me. We also have UConn, of course. We've talked about it sporadically through the course of this show, but Stephen Castle, the freshman guard for them, he went through a brief injury at the beginning of the season that sort of derailed him, but he has been steadily improving as the season's gone on. Now, the shooting is something that does still sort of hold some NBA scouts back, but he's a really good driver, whether it's finishing for himself or helping to play make and create for his teammates. And with his frame, I think that he could definitely be in the realm of a top 5 pick, especially considering some of the playmaking ability that he has. But again, that shooting is where he sort of gets dinged in terms of being a prospect. It's hard to go with a top 10 pick on a guard who can't shoot. Now, he's a fine free throw shooter, shooting around 75%, which is usually a sign that there can be something to build off of with that. But as of right now, he's probably hovering in that late lottery, but definitely somebody who can also boost his stock with UConn in the tournament. Also on that team, Donovan Clingan, talked about him, monstrous size, 7'2", 280 pounds is what he's listed as. He decided to come back to UConn this season to take on a bigger role with Adama Sanogo going to the NBA. He's one of the best rollers in the pick and roll situation in college basketball. He's got great hands. I think that should project to continue. Now, there isn't a ton of shooting with him, and the defensive versatility in terms of playing around the perimeter isn't necessarily there, which are some of the knocks against him from a pro perspective. But I do think that in terms of just being a college big, he has what you need. He's fine around the rim offensively. Not great, but good enough. Again, as a roller, he's really smart with the way that he takes his angles and how he goes about that. He's a good rim protector on the defensive end as well. I don't see him as being a super high ceiling player, but he can definitely give good minutes off of the bench in the NBA. I could see somewhere along the lines of, off the top of my head, if I were to give a comparison, maybe like a taller Andre Drummond, not the most elite of athletes, but is really good at what he does and holds it down in that aspect. We also have a couple other names here before we wrap this up. Cody Williams of Colorado, the younger brother of Jalen Williams, J-Dub on the Oklahoma City Thunder. He has a strong ability to get downhill on drives. He's a great finisher at the rim. He's a good defender, but the questions with him stem from, well, how much is there to his offensive game outside of the driving? It's really nice, but what does the shot creation look like outside of the paint? That still hasn't really been, disproven what can be there. But, I mean, with the tools that he has in terms of being a confident player that can go downhill, that can play good defense, and has the size that he has, he should be a lottery pick. Again, another guy who has had some variety in terms of where he'll fall, but should be a lottery pick, probably floor, hoping that he and the Buffs can sort of put together a little bit of a run here. I believe it's Boise State that they play first in order to reach the round of 64. But they've been playing incredible, the Buffaloes have, as a whole. Cody Williams spent a chunk of time during the middle of the season with an injury, but There's a lot of intrigue with him. He's back. The team's playing really good basketball right now, so should be a lot of fun to watch him. Again, hopefully they make it far so we can continue to sort of evaluate him. But next on the list, I have Dalton Knecht of Tennessee, the SEC Player of the Year. He transferred to Tennessee after a few years with Northern Colorado. Big time heat check guy, where he had some unreal scoring performances this season throughout the course of it. Specifically, the matchup that he and Reed Shepherd had when Tennessee and Kentucky faced off a couple weekends ago was incredibly entertaining to watch. He had 40 in that one, even though Tennessee lost. He's very athletic, too. Now, I think that that's something that could definitely help him as well. It's not that there's really any holes in his game. I think he has the athleticism that can translate to the next level. He's a very talented scorer in terms of getting to his spot. He out-physicals a lot of college players. It won't be quite as easy at the next level, but I do still think that he can hold it down. He's going to be 23 his rookie season, so that doesn't usually bode well for having an extremely high ceiling, but I do think he's going to be a very good player. And then the last player I wanted to touch on was Terrence Shannon Jr. of Illinois. I think he is in a prime position here to turn a lot of heads with the tournament play. He was third in points per game in Division I at 22.6. Crazy high motor. He's incredible in transition. He's not scared of anybody at the rim. He tested the NBA waters last year, and teams told him to work on a more consistent shooting stroke and to develop a stronger right hand. He is, of course, a left-handed shooter, finisher, and he's done so, really. It's not that the three-point efficiency, I mean, it's improved on more attempts, so that is a positive jump. He's still not lights out, but he should be a threat from the three-point line, which is at least a starter. Another older guy as well in this class, potentially. He scored 28, 40, and 34 points in the 3 Big Ten tournament games that the team just played. The 40 versus Nebraska was the single game record for the Big Ten tournament. He missed some time earlier this year when he was accused of sexual misconduct with someone. He's going to have a hearing for that in May, which will obviously have big-time implications on his future, both in basketball and, of course, in life as a whole. So, still a lot to sort of break down with that, but that is something we're not really going to get more answers on until the hearing in May. So, just on the court himself, in terms of players in position to have a big-time performance in the NCAA tournament, I do believe that Shannon could definitely be primed for that. Now, we are going to be taking our final break of the show. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be getting into the teams that didn't make the cut, the Big East surrounding, all kinds of, I don't want to call it controversy, but a lot of people feeling like the Big East got the short end of the stick, and sort of how that ties into future expansion plans for March Madness. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day, talking about the teams that did not make the cut for March Madness. That included a handful of Big East teams that had a lot of people up in arms. So we will be breaking down all of that. The selection committee did announce their first four out, which included Oklahoma, Seton Hall, Indiana State, and Pittsburgh. Just briefly talking about these teams here. Really unfortunate for Indiana State, where they were 28th in net rating, which is the highest of any program to be left out of the NCAA tournament. They were in a tough position in this year where they wrapped up their conference tournament. They lost, falling short to Drake, and then they had to sit around for a week and watch all of these other programs go on these bid stealing runs that sort of sucked up the at-large spots that would have been available to the likes of an Indiana State, but were no longer there because we had so many unexpected teams guarantee themselves a bid with the conference tournament. But some of these other teams as well, Oklahoma, interesting case for them where they didn't lose a single game outside of the first quadrant all season. They were 4-12 in quad 1, 16-0 versus everyone else, and this was just sort of an example that it's typically more about your wins than your losses when it comes to your resume and as for making March Madness. And unfortunately, that was the case for Oklahoma, where out of 13 games that they played versus tournament teams this season, they were just 2-11, both of them coming at home. So it's tough. I understand some of the arguments for them, but again, when it comes down to the way that the bubble was sort of diminished, I think that they were right to be on the outside looking in. Also briefly, Seton Hall here, 5 games over a 500 record in conference play, came out short. That is the first time that ever happened in the history of the Big East Conference, which sort of leads me to this bigger conversation about, did the Big East get screwed? Only 3 teams made the NCAA tournament this year: UConn, Marquette, and Creighton. That's the least amount that have been representing the Big East since 1993. St. John's, Providence, and Seton Hall all had arguments to be in, were in that bubble conversation for much of the season, and they find themselves on the outside looking in. All of them finished with 20 or more wins, and unfortunately for Providence in this case, relying on your wins alone was not enough to get them in. They had beaten Creighton twice. They beat Marquette once. They also had a win against Wisconsin, but it wasn't enough. And again, like we've sort of alluded to, the problem was how many teams stole bids in winning their conference tournaments, where UAB, NC State, Duquesne, Oregon, New Mexico all likely wouldn't have been at-large bids if they didn't win their conference, and instead they do, so that is 5 less spots available for bubble teams. Ultimately, I do think that it's just sort of the way that everything played out in this circumstance. I don't think that it was any sort of a specific dig at the Big East, which is one of the best conferences in college basketball, but again, the circumstances surrounding those coveted spots just sort of did not play out in the favor of many of these teams that were hoping to make their way in. Now, it's interesting now because of the conversations that come from that. We've talked sort of about the idea of whether or not the NCAA should expand March Madness, where I personally don't believe that they should, but do believe that that's the direction we're headed in, and it's just sort of the reality of the situation. But it is really interesting how I feel like this could be the type of year that could lead to change, where you have so many people upset about these solid teams that had good resumes not being able to make the tournament here. Again, expanding it to a certain degree, I just feel like it does add all of this drama and intrigue that wouldn't be there. And I know you feel upset because the teams didn't end up making it, but I also do just feel like it's part of, why do we play these regular season games if we're just going to continue to diminish the value of them? And 64 teams is a lot. Well, technically it's 68 even too that make the tournament, and I just don't really see a need for it. Now, if you're the NCAA and you're Charlie Baker, who runs the organization, the need for you is to make more money, because they would make more money. We're all sports fans, so I can at least speak for myself. I would watch the games, even though I disagree with the principle of it. And it's just interesting to see how this all works. I wasn't old enough for the last time that the NCAA expanded, but the typical dialogue you get about that time was people were up in arms about the idea of making it 64, and that was too much, and that sometimes history can repeat itself in terms of we overreact in the moment and things end up being fine. If that's the case, so be it. I just also don't really see a need for expansion, where this year had very different circumstances than usual, and I don't think that it means that the product is broken as a whole. I don't think by any means it is. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And that's been the case. March Madness is, one of probably the top two outside of the Super Bowl. I struggle to think of a sporting event in America, at least, that takes up more attention than March Madness does. And I just don't see a need to move on it. But it is really interesting to see how the conversation works, because, again, I also don't think it matters what I think, what you think. It's probably headed in a direction where the NCAA is going to expand regardless. But let me know what your thoughts are about that in the comments. I also wanted to briefly touch on the idea of the NIT tournament and some of these programs that feel that they are above it and it's not worth competing in. It's interesting because of the fact, obviously, the NIT, I could not tell you who won the NIT last year. I couldn't even really give you a great guess. I don't care for it myself all too much, but I do feel like there is something to the culture of the program individually where it's a bit unfortunate to see, and I speak on this because St. John's, Oklahoma, and Pittsburgh have all declined invites to play in the NIT, and these were 3 of the 4 teams for the first 4 out. They're all saying that they don't want to play in it. The team that is playing in it is Providence, and what I like about that is just the fact that, maybe Devin Carter doesn't play. He could be a potential NBA guy, who knows, but Kim English comes in with his first year in the program, and he's still sort of developing what it's like to be a part of Friar Nation there, and he isn't sort of taking any shortcuts, where I just don't feel that's the same way with Rick Pitino. And Pitino, when he was asked about whether or not they should make it, he didn't sound like he was overly upset about it, wasn't complaining, griping about it egregiously. I just think that it's kind of lame also to have the season end like this, where he still feels like he kind of has a lot to prove. Obviously, his overall legacy in basketball, not necessarily, but he just got to St. John's, and there's only so long we can hold it over him, but the rant that he went on about his players and saying that they're not good enough, essentially, for him. This is the least fun he's ever had coaching an individual team. Sure, they rallied around. They started winning some games. They won 6 in a row. They fell just short to UConn in terms of trying to pull out a Big East tournament win. But I still feel like he sort of should have had to establish himself with the culture there a little bit more. It almost feels like he's just already turning the page on this team. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe the players didn't want to be a part of it. I don't know, but I do feel like it's a little bit of a disappointing result. Again, I'm saying this from someone who openly admits I don't watch the NIT tournament. So maybe I'm overdoing it right now with this, but I just feel like for a lot of these programs to act like you're above this tournament, where I wouldn't say that any of these programs from Oklahoma, Pittsburgh, St. John's are at a level where they should feel like they're too good for this tournament. Now, again, maybe it's on the players. We don't really have details as to truly who is behind them pulling out, and that's not something we will ever have, but just wanted to give some thoughts on that. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We will be back tomorrow, same time, 2 o'clock. So we will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.